Hey guys, we are back with Trita Parsi. A quick dive in. I've had a bit of a rough day, so I'd actually been a little bit forgetful about our start time. Sorry, Trita. But everyone watching.
Last time it was my fault, remember?
Yeah, exactly. Actually, yeah, it's Trita's fault. This is the professional relationship we have. Anyway, Trita, my friend, what are we doing? What is Trump? At least we're not Trump. I think that's the core thing here. At least we're not the Trump administration. I spoke to Ian Bremmer earlier, and he was making it very clear just how bad a deal this is in terms of he lambasted the JCPOA, and this is what some people have called the POA. Right? It's just a plan of acquiescence, not a joint comprehensive plan of action. What do you think?
No, I think it's too early to make a judgment of that kind because we still don't know the nuclear details of this. Is it a situation in which you can say that, oh, thanks to the war, he got a better deal? No, I very, very much doubt it. And even though I do think that some aspects of the deal are going to be stronger than the JCPOA, I don't think it makes it up for having this disastrous war. But I think there's also a desire to prejudge this very negatively in certain quarters because ultimately, and I agree with this sentiment, Trump should never have left the JCPOA. He should never have started the war. There's so many things he should not have done. And the United States and the Iranian people would have been in a better situation if none of that was done. But in this current situation, when the options were to continue this war or to strike a deal, I do think that it was the right decision to strike a deal. Now we have to wait and see exactly what the details are on the nuclear front. But if some of the elements of the February deal that was on the table in Geneva that the Omanis had mediated, some of those elements are still there, such as the fact that the Iranians are not going to be enriching for several years at all. And then later on, they will only enrich for 2 reactors. And as a result, they will not build up a stockpile of enriched uranium. That is certainly stronger than some of the measures in the JCPOA. What we don't know, because there's been no reporting at all, what the inspections mechanisms would be. And part of that, of course, is because the IAEA has not been particularly involved in these negotiations. And perhaps for the natural reason that they haven't really dealt with those issues yet. That's going to be dealt with during the MOU. So I think it's too early to say, but, can you make a huge fuss about the fact that the Strait is open, mindful of the fact that the Strait was open before this war was started? I think a lot of those criticisms are legitimate. But I do worry that some Democrats are going to start to attack this deal from the right in order to sabotage it. And that would actually bring us back into a disastrous situation with a continuation of the war. And that would absolutely not be good.
But why would the Democrats want to sabotage it? Just because they have everything against Trump? Surely there's a bipartisan desire to see a non-nuclear Iran or an Iran that is more constrained, although we have to argue that this deal doesn't really do that. We can get into some of the details around the finances in a moment, but why would they do that?
Well, different Democrats would have different motivations, but there are going to be some of them who I think will be happy to sabotage it because that is the direction that the Israelis are going. And for that reason would be happy to be helpful towards the Israeli agenda of sabotaging this deal. I mean, the Israelis did do this last minute thing to try to sabotage the deal by attacking Beirut and crossing both Trump and the Iranians' red line. Others will because of just this partisan atmosphere that exists. I mean, a lot of these Republicans were doing exactly the same thing against the JCPOA. The JCPOA was 154 pages. They didn't even read the press release, so they immediately came out against it. Seconds after the deal, they were out. They had no idea what was in the deal. No one knew what was in the deal. 154 pages, a lot of it very legalistic language. They had no clue, but they were against it. And for many of the Democrats, they actually had to read it through before they came out in support of it. So unfortunately, you have this partisan atmosphere in Washington in which a lot of people simply will support or oppose things depending on who is the president. They'll support whatever the strategy is on Ukraine when Biden is doing it, but oppose it if Trump was doing it. So that type of a partisan nature of what Washington is like now is just something that we have to accept as a reality. It doesn't necessarily mean that it has anything to do with them genuinely believing that it's better to have this deal or not to have this deal.
Yeah, no. So timing being what it is, I have to grab something, but I'll ask you the following question, which is simply, do you think that this coincided with Trump's birthday deliberately?
I'm sure that the Trump administration wanted it to, or Trump himself really wanted to make sure he got it. But, it's not as if they were getting ahead of schedule. There were plenty of moments earlier on in which they thought they had it. And I think the US side was really running out of patience because things were taking far, far too longer on the Iranian side. And it's also partly because the US doesn't understand the Iranian system. It has this attitude. I mean, this whole war was premised on the idea that the Iranian system is similar to that of Saddam's Iraq or Gaddafi's Libya, in which you just take out the top person and the whole system implodes. It's absolutely not that type of a system. 135 plus top officials have been killed and were immediately replaced. It's a system. It's not a dynasty, even though, of course, the new supreme leader is the son of the previous one, which probably would not have been the case had the old supreme leader not been killed by the United States in this war.
Yeah, just on that point, Trita, because for me, what I also think is really interesting is the tweet that Trump made. I was chatting to Malcolm Nance, actually. I met him in person in London earlier. And he said that Trump's basically thrown Vance under the bus in the way that he's saying that this is Vance's deal. He was the lead negotiator or overseeing it on and off. What's your perception on that? I'm not sure if I would go that far, but certainly it looks like Trump, if this deal goes awry, which, let's be honest, it may well do, Trump can sort of wash his hands of it and blame it on his VP, who he doesn't seem very on the best terms with right now.
Oh, I don't know if that's the case, the last part. But on the first part, it's almost as if Trump took a page out of the Supreme Leader's playbook, because that's exactly how he did it with the JCPOA. In order to protect himself, he actually spoke against it, but blessed it, approved of it, but try to keep a distance so that if it would go the wrong way or collapse, he would say, I told you so. And if it went well, he would ultimately take credit. And it seems like that is exactly what Trump is doing right now. He's keeping a bit of a distance in order to protect himself in the case it goes badly. And if it goes badly, I'm sure he will throw the negotiators, including Vance, under the bus. And if it goes well, rest assured, it will be thanks to Trump, and he will take full credit for it. So, unfortunately, this is a playbook that many politicians use. But I think also there is potentially a desire on J.D. Vance's side to be able to have his name on this. I think he's put in a tremendous amount of energy, capital into this deal, into this negotiation. And if you take a look at all of the things that he has been involved in, this is the first time he really gets to have his own foreign policy issue. And from his standpoint, if he can say, I helped end the war by negotiating this deal, that is something that will be deeply appreciated by his base. And his base, JD's own base, was never in favor of this war.
So let's get into some specifics of the time that we have. Now, one of the things is the finances. And what I understand is that 3 billion has already been released, 24 billion is being made available. But then there's also this $300 billion figure, which has obviously caused a lot of people like, what the hell? But other people are saying that this is a fund and this is going to be done gradually through the Gulf states, and they don't have a choice because Iran could take out a lot of their infrastructure, desalination plants, and so on and so on. So break down these figures. What's true, what isn't? Is it just a complete runaway for the Iranians in terms of benefits?
So I am not so sure that story about the 3 billion actually is true. There was a lot of stories saying that money was coming from the UAE. I'm not sure if it's true or if it's false news aimed at sabotaging. It could be many different things. What I do know is that in the official negotiations, the Iranians were insisting on 12 billion of their $120 to $150 billion of frozen assets should be released in the beginning of the MOU, and another 12 released at the end. And 6 of the 12 billion in the beginning is actually money that already was supposed to be unfrozen back in 2022 through a deal that the Iranians had with the Biden administration. But then the Biden administration reneged on that deal because of the Masa Amini protests that erupted in Iran. So from their standpoint, they're asking essentially for 6 out of 120 to 150 billion. It's not a lot of money. From Trump's standpoint, I think the position has been that they don't want to be accused of having released any money for the Iranians upfront. Later in the deal is a different story, but upfront, they don't want to have that. So it appears that there's some sort of arrangement with some of the GCC states in which they may be releasing money. So Trump can say, I didn't release any money. And the Iranians can say, we got our money. So both sides can be happy. Both sides can insist that their statements are truthful, but nevertheless, the problem is solved. And this was one of the last sticking points in the negotiations. But it's important to understand, A, this is Iran's own money. B, this is a fraction of the amount of money the United States has frozen of Iran's money in various banks around the world. So the idea that this is some sort of a huge payout or anything like that, both gets it wrong in the sense that this is already Iran's money and is actually a small amount compared to the amount of money that the US continues to freeze.
But why are they releasing so much money? Why so much is getting unfrozen? It might sound like a stupid question, but is it because literally just Iran had so much leverage from, again, I'm going to joke slightly about the birthday point, but some people believe that Trump literally was so desperate to get it across the line on his B-Day that he was like, okay, just give them more money, or let's release more money to them. And as an act of good faith, they then won't retaliate against Israel, who seem hell-bent, the government hell-bent on jeopardizing and derailing this entire process.
Yeah, I think actually that's what we should be mostly talking about, that there is a country that is officially America's best allies, according to most people in Washington, that was hell-bent not only to destroy the previous nuclear deal and ultimately successfully doing so, starting this war, pushing Trump to start this war, and then on top of that, last minute do this operation in Lebanon in order to sabotage these talks. And they will still have plenty of opportunities to sabotage this. These 60 days are going to be very, very sensitive, and the Israelis will have significant capacity of throwing wrenches in the wheel here. That, I think, is frankly the real story, that you have a country that is so dependent on the United States, yet is acting in this way. When it comes to why the release was done, from the Iranian standpoint, they believe that they were giving up their most valuable leverage upfront, which was the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. And the blockade of the blockade was not an equivalent concession from the American side. Moreover, they were very worried that they would be giving this, and then the US would renege on the deal, which has happened a couple of times now. And as a result, in order to see that Trump is really committed, they wanted him to release some of their money upfront in the beginning. Later on, they backed off from that because at first they were actually quite skeptical and opposed to the idea that some of these GCC countries would come in the middle and kind of split the difference and sort this out. They wanted Trump specifically to release the money to show his commitment to the deal, and they didn't get that. Look, I think, frankly, both sides were in a dire need of a deal, and both sides were negotiating very hard. Trump does have very little patience, so he doesn't like it when it takes the Iranians such a long time to get a response. And I have to say, it took the Iranians quite some time because it was slow already back during the JCPOA, but it was way slower this time around. But if there's a narrative out there that Trump was desperate for a deal, I think frankly both of them needed a deal.
But wasn't it slow because they were making him stew? It was deliberate. It was a deliberate bit of delay to play mind games. Or you don't think that the Iranians had such?
No. There was definitely some of that taking place as well, in which they were trying to signal that they were very unhappy with some of the terms of the deal. They were not saying no, but they were also not saying yes. And I think more than anything, that's what drove Trump mad. If at least it was a no, they could have moved on to the next stage, but they never said yes or no. And they were trying to change some of the terms of the deal, and they were negotiating on that. And Trump doesn't like these long type of negotiations. And one of the things the Iranians are good at in these negotiations is to outpatience the other side. It's not that difficult to outpatience Trump.
Well, no, but it was always, as I think I'd said to you, but it was always a tug of war between one man's hubris and ego, narcissism, versus another collective entity's fight for survival and pragmatism, right? At least that's how I put it. And one is going to be much more breakable than the other in this case. And surprise, surprise, Trump just caved. But I'm curious what you think this does to the balance of power. Maybe we can have you back later on this week when I don't forget the actual start time.
Yeah, no, happy to do that. Let me just say something quickly. The messaging that is coming from the Trump administration is very interesting because they're going up front with the idea that this is an opportunity to change the US-Iran relationship. And then by that also change the entire region. I find it very fascinating because this is the opposite of what the Obama administration did. They wanted to strictly talk about this as a nuclear deal. If there was some sort of a plus down the road in which the US-Iran relationship moved in the better direction, that would be a bonus, a side effect, but it would not be at the center of this, which I always thought was underselling the deal. I think, a larger vision would have actually been better to sell the deal. Now, of course, they managed to get it through. So, they managed to achieve what they needed to achieve. But the Trump administration is actually upfront putting this idea that this is going to transform the relationship and potentially the region. And I find that very interesting. I'm not saying entirely that they're putting all of their eggs in that basket or really pushing for it, but it's an ambition that I think is worth having because it's not good enough just to strike these deals to avoid these wars. If the relationship is going to continue to be extremely venomous and constantly risk bringing things back into a very bad state. So if you have the ability to just change this, and the title of my third book, which is on the Obama deal, was Lose an Enemy, I think that's what they should do.
So I know you're short on time, so I've got sort of two questions for you, but they're kind of intertwined. One is simply, where does China fit into all of this? I know you're not a Sino-centric expert, but of course, China had a role to play with helping the Pakistanis as the central interlocutors. And as I made, I think, clear to Ian as well, that I think China is very much the prevailing shadow over the Middle East now. Whilst the US has its physical presence, the Chinese soft power is important. This other question is simply about these two prevailing blocks that I see emerging. On the one hand, the Saudis, the Pakistanis, the Emiratis, the Qataris, and the Turks, and Egypt to an extent. And then on the other side, the Emiratis with the Israelis, the Americans, and more broadly, India, or the I2U2. What are your thoughts to either of those points?
Well, on the first one, I do think that China's shadow has been in the background. I think the Chinese look pretty good. They didn't interfere in this. They didn't provide that much support to the Iranians. They were selling them satellite services, which they could have sold to anyone. So it's not as if it was some sort of a unique military service that they provided. They also did not interfere with Trump's blockade of the blockade. They just patiently stood out of this and had the capacity of withstanding these pressures better than anyone because of their own reserves and other things and their ability to quickly change some of their consumption of energy towards other things. And I think, again, the region, everyone else is increasingly looking at China as a constructive status quo player that values stability above all. And as a result, is increasingly the opposite of the United States, which is increasingly seen as reckless, too self-centered, disregarding of the interest of other states. And in that competition, this is a huge plus that the Chinese have. And this whole episode, with the starting of the war, just made the American position much weaker. There's no doubt about that, in my view. On the other one, we're going to have to talk about it next time because I have to jump over to another interview.
All right, Trita. I'm going to stay
Thank
on
you so much.
with your brief, but no worries, my friend. See you soon.
Thank you. Talk to you soon.
Your afternoon. Take care. All right, guys. Well, that was Trita Parsi, Executive Vice President, I think, or founder. I can't remember exactly. Co-founder of the Quincy Institute, and someone who I think has been very on point with a lot of his analysis. I know some people have their criticisms or have concerns about certain associations, but I've hosted people with far stronger and disconcerting perspectives, and I think Trita is a professional, and I think he's a very active professional. There's some academics who you host. Trust me, I host upwards of 4 people a day sometimes. And so 4 people a day over 30 days, it's 120 people. Yes, some of them might be repeats, but the point is I interview a lot of people, and Trita is one of the most active in supporting the show, sharing the program, keeping his analysis current and updated, and knowing how to get through the noise to the essence of the points. Some academics can be great in their analysis, but very stuffy or out of touch or unwilling to support independent creators or broadcasters or whatever. I don't call myself a journalist. I don't have professional journalistic training. So yeah, that's. I will continue to speak to Trita, as I will continue to try to interview everybody within a certain extent. Certain channels I know have hosted, say, Alex Jones of Infowars. I have no desire to do that, and I have no desire to sort of to speak to Liz Truss or see people of such imbecility. So. Trita, I think, has made some very astute calls, including on China. And what I wanted to ask him about is something that some of you may have heard me say in the past few weeks, but this is something I spoke to Ian Bremmer, where you can find on the channel as well, who's much more of a Western or mainstream perspective on things compared to, say, Larry Johnson or some other voices that we have on. But anyway, Ian agreed with me, which is simply, there is a new balance of power emerging. We have two blocks, and on the one side, you have the Saudis and the Pakistanis signing this strategic partnership in November of last year. Quite a sudden and out of the blue event. I covered it, and it was one of the best performing videos I've ever done, and it was because it carries a lot of significance. It shows a commitment. Okay, is Pakistan actually going to come to the support of Saudi Arabia if it's attacked? Well, it was, and not really. They didn't do anything, but it shows a commitment in principle. And on top of that, you have the Qataris. Now, keep in mind, 10 years ago, the Qataris and Saudis couldn't have been more opposed to one another. And then you have the Turks and the Egyptians. Now, Turkey is not a country I've covered as much, at least in this war, and it's something we're going to be doing more later this week with a couple of colleagues, friends who are Turkish experts, because I think Turkey sits in a really unique place in the Middle East. It's by far the most powerful military, the second biggest in NATO. It's trained to a level that none other than, say, Israel or perhaps the IRGC are. But it's always been on the periphery. It's always been ostracized, sidelined by some of the other Middle Eastern states, especially the Gulf. But that's changing, and it's been changing ever since Turkey tried to deepen its relationship with the Qataris. The Qataris like to sort of see themselves as the Switzerland of the Middle East. And so that they are a core component of this sort of group of four. Egypt is sort of there, but just partially due to its geopolitical proximity and its relationship to the West, or specifically the United States, and its role as a non-major NATO ally, means it's never going to be perhaps quite as in the same bracket. A lot of these countries obviously have perhaps more sympathy to the to the Iranians, and Ian called it the Islamic bloc, if you like, versus the Abraham bloc. So the Abraham bloc is, of course, the UAE, Israel, the United States, to an extent, India by another extent, because whatever Pakistan does, India will do the opposite, or counterbalance, and especially the Emiratis counterbalancing, or resisting the pressure of the Saudis and their growing rupture in their relationship, especially since January, as some of you have heard me say, has really led to this unique situation, and it's all represented in this I2U2, or India, Israel, United States, UAE grouping, which is looking towards sort of a more nimble or efficient, agile military architecture across the Middle East. So it's quite interesting to see how that plays out. It's not going to happen overnight, and these things aren't necessarily you wake up and suddenly the new balance of power. But the bottom line is that if you have that first group, that Islamic group, that has the support of the Chinese and the relationship, the sympathy towards the Iranians, then that is obviously going to be quite a challenge for the Israelis or the Americans to navigate. And as Trita said at the end there, the role of China it's omnipresent. It might not be physically there on the ground as much as America does, but it's it's clear that the Chinese have sway. They have influence through diplomacy, soft power, through the economics. And as we covered in a really interesting conversation with a chap called Scott Kennedy, an expert, one of the best experts on Chinese economics, China's been pretty fine, to be honest, with the war. They had concerns like everybody, but they were in a pretty cushy position. I've put the link to the Chinese conversation in the comments if you want to check it out. Well, of course you want to check it out, but it's a really good video. And we cut to the essence of China's strategic planning, of its policy making, how the CCP thinks, and also because the CCP have been through a tough time as well. They ousted, what's the word? They purged some generals from the military in January. Yeah. It was a big deal, but it barely got any coverage because Trump decided to operate in Venezuela and seize a head of state, even if I think he's a terrible bloke. But yeah, so that was a big deal for the Chinese because they very rarely go through such events like that. But anyway, guys, I thought I'd wrap this up at sort of past, give it a little bit of a well-rounded conversation. Trita will be back later on in the week. We're going to have Malcolm Nance on. And we've got a slightly more diversified set of groups coming back as well. We've done a lot of coverage on the Middle East, but as the situation in the Middle East somewhat stabilizes, then we can shift more towards Ukraine and Russia again. The situation in Africa is looking pretty terrible. Myanmar's in the situation. But yeah, I think that this deal, I think, is going to be signed on Friday. I think it is going to hold, but it's not really a deal. It's a MOU, which basically means that we agree to talk about more stuff. And in essence, the Americans are going to give the Iranians a huge amount of space to maneuver. They're going to give them a huge amount of breathing space. And those finances are going to be hugely beneficial to stabilizing the economy and therefore consolidating power. What I will be interested to ask Trita and others in the next couple of days is about the unity of the Islamic Republic, of the IRGC, because it's in a tough situation, right? The one thing that you can guarantee on is that war will unite you around a common enemy. It will unite you around a common challenge. In this case, the fight for survival against the imperialist United States of America, or that's how the Islamic Republic will frame it. But now that that's gone and the opportunity to focus on their near abroad or on their internal issues, it's going to be interesting to see whether the hardliners or moderates are dominating, and how they're going to start trying to govern the country, how they're going to start trying to allocate money. Of course, some of it's going to be laundered and siphoned off, but like, what are they going to prioritize? And I want to ask Trita a deeper dive about the Strait of Hormuz, of course, because for me, it's still, well, no one really has I think a fair amount of what we were saying with Trita or Ian was speculation a little bit, because we don't really have the internal details of the document. But the idea is that it's either the Strait of Hormuz is open as it was before, or it's basically monetized. It's monetized at the behest of the Iranians, and also to an extent the relationship with the Omanis and the Gulfs. I think that the Iranians, I don't know whether all that money is going to be given to the Iranians. I'm skeptical about how that's going to be given. But what is clear, that a lot of European nations suddenly jumped on the board or the bandwagon of releasing funds. The British, the French, the Italians, and I think a couple of others all agreed within hours that they were willing to release or unrestrict any frozen funds that they had. So regardless of whether you think that those funds should be given at all, or if it's not enough, or there's questions around the exact figures, it's a big deal. And I think it's interesting that the Europeans have decided to do this so willingly. At the end of the day, this deal, the Trump deal, is a unilateral one. It's not the JCPOA, right? The Joint Comprehensive. It isn't joint in the sense it's joint with the Europeans or joint with the Chinese and Russians. A lot of people are forgetting that the JCPOA was an incredible example of multilateral diplomacy. Again, I'm not saying it was the perfect thing, but an incredible amount of diplomacy, because you even got the Russians and the Chinese, who aren't exactly best friends of the States, to join. So it's interesting to see the Europeans already joining in this. As for whether or not I see some of you saying it's Iran's money, well, yes, it is, but that's besides the point. They put it into the international monetary system, which puts it at risk of economic warfare. That's, whether you like it or not, that's just the system. If the Iranians were the Americans and the roles were reversed, then I can guarantee you they would probably do the same thing. Where can you put pressure if you can't militarily coerce your opponent into behaving or in doing what you want? Then you're going to use other mechanisms that can cause damage indirectly, suffering, whatever, behavioral change. That's what sanctions are all about. The idea of sanctions is to induce behavioral change. And if it doesn't, then they have failed, which is why the reputation or legacy of sanctions is pretty bad. A lot of people don't think sanctions really work, and there are very few examples where they have effectively worked. So, yeah. And why don't they freeze Israeli money? Well, because Israel has a huge amount of influence over American politics, over Western politics. Again, just because I'm stating these points doesn't mean that I agree with them, but that's the reality of the situation. You have to move past what you want to be right and accept that that's the reality, right? You have to act as things are, not as you wish them to be. It's pointless getting agitated or irritated by the immorality of it or the injustice of it. Yeah, sure. That's the reality. That's the situation. I think that the Islamic Republic is a abhorrent government to the Iranian people, but I also think the Israeli government is abhorrent in the way that they are dominating Lebanon. Who decides America and Israel? Yeah, kind of. That's just what it is. That is where hard power is more. If you're the most powerful country, or you spent the past 80 years managing the international system since the Second World War, then yes, you kind of have the luxury. Again, whether you like it or not. But that's why there's a growing anti-American sentiment. That's why people like Larry Johnson, like I don't know, Nick Fuentes, anyone who is critical. There's plenty of channels on this website, the Duran, other channels who are much more anti-American imperialism. The Grey Zone, right? The Grey Zone is a very well-known media organization which is heavily critical of NATO, of American imperialism, or they perceive as American imperialism and expansionism, all this sort of stuff. I fully understand that, but that's it's I can guarantee that if one country doesn't do it, another will. So but that growing sentiments, more and more countries want to decouple or de-risk from the United States, from the weaponization of the dollar, from the aggression of tariffs or sanctions. That's what they want to do. Well, that's why countries like China, who personally I'm not a massive fan of the CCP, I don't think they can be trusted, are gaining popularity, because China's just saying, hey, we're not starting wars, we're not invading you, we're not doing all this. And that works. If America was more responsible and more restrained and not such a hypocrite, or the West more broadly wasn't such a hypocrite, then it might not be as disliked and criticized as it is. So when I talk about these things, it's not because I sort of fully agree with them. And if you don't mind my accent, well, it's the best one there is in the world. So get used to it. I can actually speak English pretty well. But anyway, thanks for watching, everyone. If you're new, then, well, I have opinions and I will make them, and we host plenty of others, which keep it interesting. The point of this show is not to be an echo chamber. It's to be a diverse space for debate, not simply discussion or sort of something. It's not just interviews. I want to challenge the people I speak to. So anyway, guys, thanks a lot for watching, and we'll see you all tomorrow. More streams coming, more interviews coming, more solo analysis. So be there or be squared. Have a good night.